Hello and welcome to Flip Video Lesson 6.01, Organizing for Change. This goes along with your Human Odyssey reading pages 593 to 601, and then your student guide, this book right here, pages 372 to 374. Unit Introduction, Answers and Questions. In the 19th century, people were confident they could improve society. So when cities grew too fast and workers were forced to live in filth, they decided it was time to take action. Scientists worked on disease, city governments worked on sanitation, industrial workers organized unions to improve conditions, and women demanded a voice. Writers, artists, and musicians sought answers to serious questions too. And entrepreneurs, business leaders with vision, considered the cities and the people in them in a whole new way. Lesson Introduction, Organizing for Change. During the Second Industrial Revolution, millions of people descended on overcrowded cities searching for jobs. They were soon working long hours in filthy, dark, and crowded factories. At the end of an exhausting day, they trudged home on narrow, garbage-strewn streets and packed themselves into overcrowded, rat-infested apartments. Most factory owners and landlords refused to take any responsibility for the dreadful conditions, but other people, including some photographers, brought the situation to the public's attention. Reformers demanded change, visionaries looked for ways to make cities healthy and livable, and workers and women began to get organized. Learning objectives for this lesson. Many of these objectives are covered in detail in the readings from your Human Odyssey book, pages 593 to 609. Obviously, we'll cover several during this flip video, but they are more in detail in your book, so do make sure that you are completing your readings. So the objectives: describe the conditions city dwellers faced in places such as Paris, London, and New York. Describe the conditions most industrial workers faced. Explain the reasons for the population growth in the cities of the 1800s. Explain the role of trade unions and describe the methods they used to improve working conditions. Identify Louis Pasteur and describe his accomplishments. Identify significant leaders of the women's rights movement of the late 19th century and early 20th centuries, and describe their methods and accomplishments. Give examples of the ways Paris and New York addressed their problems, and review historical events. This goes with questions number 1 and 2. So go ahead and open your book to page 372. Okay, and this will start on question number 1. Numbers 1 and 2, urban population and factories. In the 19th century, urban population grew dramatically because many people moved to the cities to find jobs in factories. Most factories were noisy, dark, and crowded. People worked very long hours and earned very low wages. Question number 3, Paris in the late 19th century. When Napoleon III became emperor in 1852, Paris was different than we think of it today. The narrow winding streets were dark and filled with horse manure and garbage. The city was riddled with crime and diseases. Newcomers were pouring into the crowded city and squeezing into rat-infested housing. Number 4, Napoleon III and Eugene Haussmann transformed Paris. Haussmann, under the direction of Napoleon III, tore down slums and eliminated the narrow streets in large sections of the city. He installed new aqueducts, sewers, an underground rail system, and elegant gas lights. He built impressive government buildings, more than 273,000 new dwellings, broad new tree-lined boulevards, parks, monuments, and traffic circles. Questions number 5 and 6. Let's see if I can pull this down a little bit here. I feel like we're cutting off some of our screen. There we go. In the 1900s, New York had the world's busiest ports, busiest banks, and busiest industries. The rapidly growing population had reached 3 million. 80% of the residents were European immigrants. New York faced a special challenge trying to handle its growing population. The heart of the city is on the small island of Manhattan, and until steel was mass-produced and elevators were invented, it was not possible to build buildings taller than 4 or 5 stories. Question number 7. Frederick Law Olmsted, Central Park, New York. Frederick Law Olmsted, who lived 1822 to 1903, is regarded as the founder of American landscape architecture. He is best known for designing the grounds of New York City's Central Park and the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C. Frederick Law Olmsted wanted Central Park to be an enormous park with a place of calm and harmony that seemed entirely natural, unlike the formal parks in most European cities. Central Park included many wide-open areas and almost 5 million trees and shrubs. This does not go with a specific question. It's just an interesting chart to look at. So the population density, the number of people living in each unit of area, such as a square mile. And if you take a look there from 1870 all the way up to 2019, and the difference, New York City all the way up through, and then we can compare Cleveland, Cincinnati, and Columbus. Okay, so if you look in New York City in 1870, it was almost 58,000 people. In New York City, that's right here. And then in New York City in 2019, 25,000 people. So you can imagine how crowded it was. If you've ever been to New York City and you see how crowded it is now, imagine how crowded it was then with more than double the amount of people in the same area. This is questions 8, 9, and 10. Louis Pasteur. Louis Pasteur had made his reputation by studying how tiny microbes affected wine. He proved that he could kill the microbes that had been spoiling the wine. The process he developed to keep wine, milk, and other food products from spoiling became known as pasteurization. Pasteur experimented with vaccines. He injected an old culture of chicken cholera microbes into a hen. The hen, injected with old culture, only became mildly sick and recovered quickly. When the hens that had been injected with the old culture were re-injected with fresh culture, they were not affected. Pasteur also created vaccines against anthrax and rabies. Questions 11 and 12, unions. Iron workers, coal miners, and other workers began to organize trade unions. Trade unions bargained with employers for better hours, improved wages, and better working conditions. When collective bargaining failed, employees sometimes went on strike. Questions 13, 14, and 15. Again, unions continued. Workers at the Bryan and May match factory in England went on strike because the workers, mainly women, objected to fines and rules against talking, dropping matches, or visiting the restroom without permission. When some employees were fired for protesting the rules, all the workers went on strike. The owners finally gave in and rehired the protesters and eliminated the fines. Employers created blacklists of union organizers. People on the list were frequently fired or denied employment. A British immigrant named Samuel Gompers organized the American Federation of Labor. By 1900, it had more than 1 million members. Questions 16, 17, and 18, women's rights. In 1848, women held the first conference for women's rights in Seneca Falls, New York. Susan B. Anthony was arrested and fined for trying to cast a vote in the U.S. presidential election in 1872 because women were not allowed to vote. Many people objected to giving women the right to vote because some said women were not intelligent enough to vote. Others thought that giving women the right to vote might destroy the family. Questions 19 and 20, again, concentrating on women's rights. Emmeline Golden Pankhurst became famous because she campaigned in Britain for the right of women to vote, and she founded the Women's Social and Political Union, or WSPU. She and other WSPU members interrupted political meetings and once tried to storm the House of Commons in Parliament to demand the right to vote. She was jailed repeatedly and went on hunger strikes until all British women were finally allowed to vote in 1928. New Zealand became the first nation to grant women full voting rights. Optional additional information. The next 3 pages have additional information about the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, which played an important role in the improvement of factories. There are no student guide pages to go with them. Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. On March 25, 1911, a pleasant springtime afternoon, a fire broke out in a garment factory near Washington Square in New York City's Greenwich Village. Within minutes, the entire floor of the 10-story tower was full of flames. Onlookers drawn by the column of smoke and clamor of converging fire wagons watched helplessly and in horror as dozens of workers screamed from the 9th floor windows. They were trapped by flames, a collapsed fire escape, and a locked door. Firefighters frantically cranked a rescue ladder which rose slowly skyward, then stopped at the 6th floor, fully extended. Pressed by the advancing blaze, workers began leaping and tumbling to their deaths on the sidewalk. Other workers perished in flames. Still others plunged into an open elevator shaft, while behind the factory 24 fell from the flimsy fire escape. In all, 146 workers, most of them immigrant young women and girls, perished in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. For 90 years, it stood as New York's deadliest workplace disaster. And there's a link there that you can look at on your own time. It will be listed in class notes. We'll also talk about this during class time. So this having to do with the Triangle Waist Fire led to definitely some different changes and helped to kind of push that along. So the poor working conditions, workers and trade unions drew attention to poor working conditions. They held demonstrations, wrote flyers and newspaper articles, and went on strike. In the 19th century, most people were suspicious of the unions and supported the business owners. The Triangle Shirtwaist Fire brought many of the working conditions to light. Many members of the public were outraged after the fire. Newspapers published political cartoons and critical articles and editorials condemning the terrible working conditions and demanding that the government make and enforce workplace safety laws. Balance of changing powers. During most of the 19th century, people were sympathetic to the factory owners and were suspicious of labor unions. However, people became more aware of the terrible working conditions, and in some of the factories, workers and unions gradually gained support. I know that's a little bit of a repeat there. In the early 20th centuries, unions gained political power, laws were passed, and gradually the factory conditions began to improve. And here we come to the end. And this is a picture of the Triangle Fire Memorial, which is in New York City, with all of the names of those who perished during the fire. Thank you for joining me today for this flip video lesson.